Spirit. And it relates to our worship, our practice theme for the month, deep listening. Or if you read the complete title, Living Love Through the Practice of Deep Listening. So it's always connected to that central value of love. Deep listening is a skill that can be learned. I had a very hard time learning that because I am a deep talker. And deep listening is not something that comes natural to me, so I always have to remind myself. Some people acquire this skill much more easily than others. In the message that I wrote in the Beacon Weekly newsletter this past Tuesday, I listed several good listening skills. And not being a good listener, I forgot several of the 9 that were mentioned. But they are there for our reference. And then I turned to deep listening. And there I do remember the specific prompts that were listed about deep listening. It requires practicing silence, reflection, and presence. So I keep telling myself, remember, and it begins with silence. We live in a culture where being silent is often punished by our conversation partners or leaders who blurt out, "Don't you have anything to say?" I remember hearing that a lot when I was a kid. And then I always had something to say, not necessarily bright things. So not saying something is often considered a bad thing. And if we're treated this way during our childhood, it might have been quite traumatizing, and it follows us in adulthood. But when we can become comfortable with inviting ourselves into silence, we slow down our inner self, and we can avoid quick reactions that are controlled by our amygdala, our so-called lizard brain. And you have seen that at work when you listen to that story, the lizard brain of the elephant, of the ostrich, and the other animals, the chicken. But if we can control that, if we can slow down our inner selves, we open up a space for reflection before we respond to what others say and what we think they feel. And when we offer our complete presence, we can really hear the spoken words that our conversation partners would hope that we hear. Rabbit was very good at that, just kept sitting there very still. And we can also hear their unspoken words, what is in their hearts. These kinds of skills are learned by ministers during their seminary years, and especially in those months of clinical pastoral education where we learn to provide spiritual care. Some of us learn it much quicker than others. Time and again in my clinical training for providing pastoral care, I would be reminded by my mentor to listen, to avoid falling into that role of a social worker who gives advice on how to solve problems. Let me tell you how to deal with that kind of thing. Or, how can I help you? That just kind of puts the burden on the person who is already suffering. Now they have to come up with a way to help themselves. No, let's not say that. A spiritual caregiver does not solve problems for the person or the patient. My mentor once told me that they told me several times, that the very best way in which I could provide spiritual care to a patient is to say nothing. But generally, there will be an exchange of words when we provide spiritual care to others, either as a minister, a chaplain, or a lay person. And that person who does that will practice the art of deep listening. There is a psychologist I think I'm going to write some more about what he said. His name is David Grove. He's from New Zealand. He's part Maori. And he developed a way of listening that is called clean language, unencumbered language. Language to provide spiritual care to people who have gone through traumatic experiences. And these are some of the things we do if we use clean language. We honor the other person's choice of words. We don't say things like, "Oh, I think you mean this." No, we take their words. We use their own frame of reference, their metaphors, not our own. And we create an opening for the person to explore their experiences in ways that allows them to heal and to move on if that's what they are ready to do, or not to move on if they're not. So how do we create that opening? If we know of no other way to do it, we can be silent and sit with the person, just like Rabbit did in our story. And some generic responses to the situation are obviously to be avoided. I'm sure you can come up with your own list, but I wrote down a couple of very generic ones, like when we say, "Oh, everything happens for a reason." It's usually not helpful. Or saying, "They are in a better place now." No. Or saying, "Oh dear, this is so awful, I can't deal with this." The first two of these responses are clearly insensitive. And the last one is kind of an example of what can happen if we do not keep proper boundaries and do not do our own inner work before we get involved in spiritually caring for others. It's not about us and our pain. I do not profess to be an expert yet in all of this. But after 3 months of full-time immersion in a hospital, I got better. During my training, I had to interact with patients in a facility that will be unnamed for confidentiality purposes. And some patients there were depressed, even suicidal, and felt they had nothing to look forward to. And in addition to one-on-one meetings with patients, I also had to facilitate group sessions where patients shared their feelings and experiences. And afterwards, I had to go into this very complicated medical record system. It was called, we use the EPIC system, and there's also, I think another one is called Genesis. But in EPIC, we had to go into the portion where we were allowed to make notes, and make notes about who said what. So if there were 12 people sitting in a session, you'd have to remember how to do that, and who did say what. So definitely deep listening was important. And I was told a trick in case you ever have to do this in a small group. One of my teachers said, take a sheet of paper and write down the first names of the people as they are sitting in the circle around you. And then once you'll remember the faces, and once in a while you can write down a word that reminds you of what they said. And then you can remember it when you go into that system and you have to make notes. That was useful for me, not just in spiritual care situations, but in all situations. That's a soft skill that I have carried with me. Now, one day, one of the group participants I had to meet with also had to meet with me personally a short time afterwards. And I had a most incredible experience as a caregiver. She had been depressed to the point of being suicidal. And at the beginning of our one-on-one session, she looked rather hopeful. I didn't say, you look really good today. I just kind of sat there. I practiced being present, being open, being silent. And this is what she was eager to tell me. She said, I'm paraphrasing, but She said, in our group meeting we just had, there was a goldfinch just outside the window. It was at the same level as my head on the other side of the window pane. That goldfinch was fluttering in the sun, and the sun was also shining on my hair. And she told me that God had given her a clear message, and this message was conveyed through me. God was speaking through me to her and told her that she should have hope in the future. That future would be a good future. Now, between you and me, there is no way in which I really believe that God was speaking to me through this patient or the spirit of the universe. I mean, that would take some hubris to think that that was really happening. But I was able to keep an open, interested stance, receive the words that the patient was saying. It was their truth, their metaphors, their feelings. I was receptive to hearing what she had to say, and said, just at the end, that it was good to see that she had been working through her difficulties in this way, to kind of add to this positivity of the day. It is important to realize that anyone who expresses pain and concerns, they are speaking their truth, their reality, not ours. And it's our job as spiritual caregiver not to judge or to evaluate or to put the patient in their place. It's our job to listen, to be open. Many congregations have a committee or a team that practices such skills as part of spiritual care. Spiritual care is partly an art. It's the art of providing a compassionate, non-anxious presence to another person or to a group of people. Another term for non-anxious presence is non-reactivity. We don't say, oh my God, or we don't say, really? No, we just listen. We are non-reactive, a non-reactive presence. And that opens up the space for the person or persons to speak their reality. The art of spiritual companioning involves the art of listening, especially deep listening. It also involves prayer, an overall sense of empathy, and working through our own shame so that we don't bring up inappropriate things when we sit with someone else. Here are some useful characteristics to use or to acquire. In my case, it was acquire when I was in clinical training. If we want to apply our caring spirit and be a good spiritual companion. And in my little list that's coming up, a very short list, I'm using the words of the Reverend Melissa Carver-Ziemer, who begins by saying, spiritual companioning is never about fixing, never about advising, never about directing. Our own perspective, she says, is always biased. So keep our own judgment out of it. Our own perspective undermines the person's agency and their capacity to solve their problems, which is eventually theirs to do, or not to do as they choose. Spiritual companioning is about helping someone tune in to the voice that is speaking in their own life. And once that child in the story got going, he just got going and kept going and going and going and going, and Rabbit listened. We can call this voice that speaks in our own life, we can call it intuition. Or when we deal with other people, we can call it loving community, inner wisdom, God, or something else. And how do we do this? Sometimes it is by inviting the person to remember practices that support their capacity to open their heart and to be more resilient, to center. And how do we do that? We might ask, how did that happen? Explain something more about that. And that gets the conversation going without us having to do things like judging or correcting or anything like that. So this requires that we be patient and that we sit with the person long enough so that they can sift through thoughts and feelings that they need to sort through and that they can name in order to access their own deeper wisdom. And that is why my mentor at this place, at this facility, often told me, try to provide your spiritual care by saying nothing. Just sit there, say nothing. And then the other person will say what they need to say. And that opens up things. Sometimes also a prayer is called for. I was not raised in a tradition that is keen on prayer, like Catholicism, for example. Eventually I turned to Buddhism. Buddhists don't really pray in the sense that one understands in a Judeo-Christian tradition, for example, or even in earth-based traditions. But sometimes it's called for. So when I was getting my spiritual training, my spiritual care training, I also had to practice saying prayers, because you wouldn't believe how many people ask for a prayer. Not a prayer they say, but they want you, the spiritual caretaker, to pray for them. That same mentor who talked to me and gave me so many good ideas, when I exchanged with him the kinds of things that had been happening in my interactions, and I said, and then this person asked me to pray for them. He said, people always ask you to pray for them. I wonder why that is. And I thought, yeah, why is that? But something must have been happening. So I had to think about what a prayer is. And I had learned in seminary from one of my teachers, a prayer has 3 parts. You may recognize those parts when I do my prayers. Who are we? What do we need? And what help do we hope to get to achieve what we need? Well, that sounds a little pragmatic and down to earth, so I like a description that's a little more spiritual and a little longer. So a non-sectarian prayer that you can use in many situations with people you provide spiritual care to has 5 parts. It has an address. To whom do we address it? It has an expression of gratitude, which is always good. A recognition of the challenge or the difficulty that is being faced here. A blessing and an ending. It can be spoken aloud or it can be said silently in our hearts. So here is one. Spirit of love, Spirit of life. So that's the address. We are thankful for being together today and for the love shown to Ali by their family. That's the gratitude. Ali is feeling frustrated and fearful about their medical treatment. That is the challenge part. May they be granted courage to face the days ahead so that they can enjoy moments of peace and delight in their family. The parts that start with may are the blessing. And then we end by saying Amen and blessed be. And sometimes somebody who we address the prayer for might say something, and in the name of, and whatever fields they need to add, that is good, and then I say Amen and blessed be. So I was deeply affected by everything I learned during this experience. And some time ago, when I was at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Greater Lansing for my internship, I had to do a big internship project. And I took on the task of summarizing the teachings on spiritual care that are offered by the Unitarian Universalist Association's Learning Institute. Some of you may have looked at those. They are long. I think if you just listen to the podcast, it might be like 45 hours or something like that. It's very long. So I offered to do my special project on summarizing what was going on there. So I condensed those dozens of hours into a PowerPoint presentation that had only 20 slides. I was very proud of that. And so proud that I'm going to share a little bit more of the content of that project in my weekly messages. I hope it may be useful, because we can learn to be, or we can practice, some of us, many of us know how, but we can be an even more loving, more compassionate congregation if we nurture that caring spirit that is inside us. From the stillness, from the silence that is allowed for by our caring spirit, we can hear the things that bubble up from people's hearts, from their concerns. Let us breathe for a few moments on that. Let us breathe in peace and breathe out love. May it be so. Let us now rise in body or spirit for our closing hymn, number 352 in the Grey Hymn